Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. All right, Christos Anesti, nice to see you.
Alithos Anesti.
Thank you. Yeah. So, we'll continue now with we are in Give Me a Word, and we left off on page 168. So, okay, so number 3 on Chronios, number 3, it says, a brother asked Abba Chronios, in what way does one arrive at humble-mindedness? And this is a sort of the $1,000,000 question. I mean, in the sense that, as you may have remembered from all the other things we've heard, especially from Abba Dorotheos, how if a person has humility, well, then everything else comes in afterwards. And humility is, he called, remember, the mortar that holds together all the other virtues. So it's like the most important thing. So that's why this is their one of their primary goals is, how am I going to get humility? And their various fathers would emphasize various aspects of this struggle to acquire humility. One of the most common answers is to have obedience, because when we're obedient to someone, we're cutting off our will. That's when we're humbling ourselves. And so that can be and that can be something not just to your elder in a monastery, if you're in a monastery, but also just to anyone who wants things to be done a certain way. 9 times out of 10, it's perfectly fine to have things done their way. Only on rare exceptions, we really have to insist, or discuss and say, no, this is not okay, your idea. But anyway, this elder here, Abba Chronios, he says simply, well, through the fear of God. But then he asks, then how do you get the fear of God? And then he says, well, in my opinion, there are 3 things. This is withdraw himself from every affair. In other words, leave the world and go in the middle of the desert somewhere. And the second thing is to dedicate yourself to physical toil. And the third thing is to remember his departure from the body and judgment of God. In other words, to remember that you're gonna die. So these 3 things, going out in the desert, working physically, and remembering death. Obviously, the first one is something that only applies to monks, because you can't just abandon your family and disappear. But the other 2 really do apply to everyone. So, for example, this idea of physical toil being something that is conducive to the fear of God and humility, that is something that we all can do. And it's sort of interesting that in our current, at least in the Western world, the current sort of prevailing unsaid philosophy is we want to have as many labor-saving devices as possible. We want to make our life as easy as possible. And so, of course, this does have the one effect of being efficient with our time, but of course, it also has the drawback of making us lazy, and in general, any tool runs the risk of becoming a crutch. And so this idea of physical toil is something that's really the value of it's underemphasized. And besides, there's simply the physiological effect of, if you're exerting yourself physically, it's very good for your body and for your mind and your mood and everything. So physical toil, there's a lot to be said for that. And then the third thing he says, bearing in mind his departure from the body. And so, in other words, when you remember that, I am going to die someday, and sort of imagine, okay, what is this going to be like? How will it be like to be on my deathbed and to know this is it, I'm going to be judged? Of course, this brings the fear of God, and this brings also a realization of how many times we haven't lived up to our calling, and that brings humility. So that's what he's talking about here. Okay, and then the next one.
Father?
Yes, Tim.
That's really helpful and stuff I need. I just wanted to share a quote that I thought might apply too. It's less ascetic, but just that, humility is not thinking, or how does it go?
Oh, C.S. Lewis, thinking less about thinking more lowly, less of yourself, but thinking of yourself less.
Exactly. Yeah. It's not thinking less of yourself, but thinking of yourself less. Exactly.
Yeah. yeah, and that is a very fascinating a facet of humility, because a humble person, he's not worried, he's not thinking about himself, he's constantly caring for and worried about the other people. And I'll repeat this story because it's so cute. I know I've probably told you this already, but this time when there was a priest arguing with a layperson, the layperson got so angry, he punched the priest, and then the
Ooh.
priest, yeah, and then but then the priest, even though he was obviously in pain for being punched, he fell at the guy's feet and said, "Oh, forgive me, I should have warned you what a big sin it is to punch a priest." And so obviously, this is an example of how of this idea of being humble has to do with just caring about the other person, not really thinking about yourself all the time. So yeah, so that is a good way of thinking about humility. Yeah. Okay. And then in number four, Cronius, page 168 to 169, he again someone he's talking again about this idea of physical activity and labor being something that helps us and that leads us to God. And so I just want to just also talk a little bit more about this idea of the importance of toil and what the other saints of the church have had to say about this. There's so Saint Anthony the Great was I'll just read you the story from how Saint Athanasius the Great wrote it. He says, once when the holy Abba Anthony was residing in the desert, overcome by listlessness, in other words, he was tempted to just be lazy and not inspired, and he had a great darkening in his thoughts. He was saying to God, Lord, I want to be saved, but my thoughts do not leave me alone. What am I to do in my affliction? How can I be saved? And then going outside his cell a little way, Anthony saw somebody like himself sitting, working, then standing up from his work and praying, sitting down again, working at rope braiding, and then standing to pray once more. It was an angel of the Lord sent to correct Anthony and to assure him. And he heard the angel saying, act like this and you shall be saved. And then it says, St. Anthony experienced much joy and courage on hearing this, and acting in that way, he went on being saved. So, in other words, this is something that has to do with our human nature. I mean, we do need variety in our daily life, and we need we need to have something to work at and to see progress. It's just something in our nature. And in fact, even the Holy Fathers even say that the very first thing, the very first commandment in the entire Bible was what God said to Adam and Eve. He said, "Okay, here you are in this garden of delight in Eden, and what you need to do is you need to tend to the garden." So in other words, the very first command of God is to work, and so this is something inherent in human nature that gives us satisfaction and meaning, and there's even a very cute incident in the Desert Fathers, who his name was Abba Paul, and maybe it's coming up later in this book. This might be a spoiler, but anyway, what happened was this Abba Paul, he lived so far away. He lived 7 days journey by foot away from the rest of civilization. So I mean, imagine that if you want to go do something, you have to go walk for 7 days just to get there, or if he needs to go get groceries, which of course he didn't probably do. He'd probably because things would be spoiling by the time he got back. But anyway, so what this monk with this Abba Paul would do is he used to collect palm branches, the fronds, and 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 force himself to work for every day as if this were his means of support. In other words, he would take these leaves and weave baskets, and because that's what there's a typical thing that the monks of the desert do. They would weave baskets and then they would go into town and sell them. And so what he would do is he said so when his cave was filled with a whole year's work, in other words, he made like who knows how many dozens or hundreds of baskets, he would burn up what he had so carefully toiled over each year, and so and so that and the point was that there's no point in having, because obviously you couldn't take all these dozens or hundreds of baskets into town, 7 days journey and sell them. But he didn't need them either, that need to get money. So he just burned it up. And so the whole point was that he needed to keep his hands busy in the same way Saint Anthony needed to keep himself busy. Sort of, yeah. So this is something that just has to do with the inherent value of working. But then, and there's a reason for this too, that St. John Cassian talked about. He said, there is a saying among the ancient fathers of Egypt that a monk who is working is tempted by only one demon, while an idle one is attacked by a numberless multitude of demons. And so, and this is perhaps something we know from our own experience. And there's even a saying, what has it go? The mother of all, no, the idle hands are the devil's. What was that?
The idle hands of the devil's play.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. So it's, and this is something that just common experience in people in the world know, that when we're idle, we don't have anything to do. That's when we get ourselves into trouble. And I would say that's even more so nowadays, because if we can just we can waste endless hours online. So yeah, so this being idle is a real problem. So that's why it is very wise for us to have things to keep us busy, and so that we're not, because it does help also with our thoughts, as these holy fathers would say. And then St. John Cassian also added, he said, it is hardly possible to determine what depends on what here. That is, whether these fathers of the desert practice manual labor ceaselessly because of their spiritual meditation, or the other way around, whether they acquire such remarkable progress in the spirit and such luminous knowledge because of their constant labor. So he's saying, that one thing helps the other. By having something to occupy ourselves with, it helps us to be more calm inwardly, and then meditate on spiritual things.
Why do you think that there's been a shift in the psychological collective, like, of society? Like, a couple of generations ago, people were doing their farming or whatever morning to night, but now people live to have leisure time. Like, it's like, okay, I gotta get off work so I can do nothing, myself included. So why is there this shift towards we want to do nothing, as opposed to thousands of years didn't want to do nothing?
That's a good question. I don't know. I mean, I guess, my guess is, I can guess that it has to do with how not because pleasures are more easily acquired nowadays. It's more easy to become addicted to the dopamine that we get out of something that's pleasureful. And in fact, there's even a book called Dopamine Nation. Have you heard about that book? I haven't read it, but I know it talks about this. The summary of the summary of the sense of the book that I think I read the back cover of it. It said basically, where our society is training us to become addicted to dopamine, whether that means going online or whatever it is that gives us dopamine. We're rushing to that. And I think part of the problem is just the advances in technology that give us the ability to have free time. Because in the old days, simply to survive, you really didn't have a lot of free time as you do now. Because, for example, now, if in order to wash your clothes, you just throw them in the washer, press a button, and they're washed. And so that saves you whatever amount of time that they used to spend washing clothes. And then multiply that by all the other things in life you have that make things go faster. Well, then, it is very possible for people to have a lot of free time on their hands. And also, I think, and it doesn't help also that many people are financially quite well off, which means they really don't have to spend a lot of time working, so they'll have even more free time. So yeah, so I think that all these things contribute to it. I don't know if maybe someone else has some insights on that too, but that's my take on it.
Well, like, I mean, I don't have any specific insights, but I feel like it's never enough, the relaxation that people are seeking. You know, before you go on vacation, you were lucky if you got to go once every 2 years, or, you know, now it's like, oh, let's go here for the weekend. Or you just hear the young kids, especially,
Yeah.
they're looking, it's not enough just to go someplace. They're like, oh, I'd like to go water skiing there. Or, do you know what I mean? It's like such
Yeah.
a above, and I don't know. I just hear them.
Yeah.
You know,
I also wonder if it doesn't have something to do with the breakdown of the family and also how we live our subsistence. Because before, you're doing everything at home for home to survive. So you're farming, you're making your own food, you're, you know, raising animals, you're sewing, you're cooking, you're cleaning. So many of us now are like, you have to go to work. But what is work? And a lot of people hate what they do because they can't identify with it. And it's not really for survival. It's really for a paycheck to go back to the thing. So maybe that's something to do with it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I would say it also the general empty. I mean, there's the general emptiness that people have nowadays. It's becoming more and more widespread as people distance themselves more from, you know, from a spiritual life and from a traditional way of being. And so that emptiness is going to make them even more desperate to grasp onto some kind of pleasure. Yeah.
That's what it is. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
just, they're trying to feel full. Yes, and they're trying to feel full.
Find what it is that
That's missing.
fills up
The
their.
primary satisfaction.
Yes, yes, yes.
Because if they could find it, then they would be full.
Yeah.
They wouldn't need
Right.
any of the above.
So we
So
just
I agree, it's that emptiness and you're filling it up with just
secondary
more-
satisfaction.
Yeah. these like quick satisfactions that don't fulfill what you're really looking for.
Yeah, because then it's over and then you're back to where you started from.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's this just crazy.
Yeah, it
cycle,
is.
right?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay. Yeah.
Bobby's
Well, you get the microphone. Yeah, and this kind of feeling of something's missing inside of us. It's something that plagues everyone, including even monks. Because I remember Jan de Frem in his homilies to us at Philotheu at Mandathos, I remember very distinctly once told us, you know, sometimes in the life of a person, whether it's a monk or a lay person, you know, a person feels an emptiness inside them, and that there's something is missing. They need that they need to fill this gap with something. And he says, don't go searching here and there for something that's going to fill that gap, because there's only one thing that will really fill this gap, and it's really the presence of God in your soul, and especially by focusing on the Jesus prayer. He said that if a monk feels empty, the problem is that he's not saying the Jesus prayer. He's forgotten God, and because he's forgotten God, he's away from the source of God, the source of warmth and joy, and then he starts like feeling in want, like sort of like in the parable of the prodigal son. The person, you know, he goes away from his father, and then he realizes how poor he is and hungry, and then of course in the parable he realizes, oh, let me go back to my father and I'll be okay. And so that's what we also need to do, even if we haven't distanced ourselves in visible ways from God. Okay, so and let me just say one more thing about the value of labor. And this is from something from Abba Dorotheos. He said, what relationship does bodily labor have with the disposition of the soul? I will explain this to you. When the soul fell away from the keeping of the commandments of God into disobedience, it gave itself over to love of pleasure, having come to love the things of the body. And so there's like, you know, us in general, you know, especially in the Western world, we're falling away from God. And so because of that, our ability to enjoy the refined kind of higher pleasures of praying, of being quiet, of enjoying nature, of these kind of things that are sort of on a higher level, we lose our sensitivity to that, and then we can only want some kind of coarser kind of pleasure. It's sort of like someone who, someone who can't appreciate a gourmet cooked meal. All they want is a candy bar kind of thing. And then Abhidharma says, and then from then on, when a person is in this state of just seeking pleasure, this wretched soul has suffered together with the body and conforms with all that it does. This is why the elder said that bodily labor leads to lowliness of mind, to humility. That labor therefore humbles the soul, and when the body is humbled, the soul is humbled with it. So this humbling of the body by making it work, by exerting yourself physically, it trains us not to do what's comfortable and easy in the moment, but to say, okay, I'm going to exert myself now physically because there's some long-term or medium-term goal that this exertion is going to accomplish. And so that's why I think it's so important not only to have physical labor, but also all the things we do with our bodies. So for example, like fasting, for example, this is something that takes effort, but it trains ourselves to deny ourselves for something that's immediately pleasant, for something beneficial in the long term. Okay, so moving on to page 169, Cronius number 5, and there's the story of this person there's one monk there who didn't have a proper leviton, and the leviton, this is a white robe that the monks used to wear for church. And by the way, there is a glossary in the beginning of the book on page 23 that has all these terms in italics. And it was white, because in the early days of Egypt, all the monks would wear white robes, and they would be shaved, their heads completely, including the nuns. They'd also shave their heads completely. So it's a very different kind of appearance in those days. But anyway, but then this monk says, why aren't you wearing a nice leviton like everybody else? And he says, oh, I don't have anything. And so the other monk gave him a leviton, and then he looked like an angel. But then it turns out that when they're going to send him to the capital to the emperors for some matter, he said, oh, no, I can't go because I'm a slave and they'll get me and whatever. But then it turns out that he was the commander of the Praetorian Guard, and so that the Praetorian Guard those were the emperor's bodyguards, but they were also people who had a lot of political influence. So that it turned out that this guy who was just dressed so poorly in this Egyptian monastery was someone who actually is this super high-ranking politician guy, and he was just acting as if he's just a nobody. So yeah, and this has to do with just this whole idea of I don't want worldly glory, I'm sacrificing it all for the kingdom of heaven. Okay, so now page 170, and here there's a story about a young boy who wanted to be out in the monasteries with these monks, but they said no, we can't have him here, he'll be a temptation for us. And it's not exactly clear what kind of temptation he is. I mean, maybe it was like a carnal kind of thing, because there are some mentions in the Holy Fathers where for monks who never see any women at all, seeing the face of a boy who doesn't have a beard reminds them of women, and so they just don't even want to see young boys. Like that's why there isn't a rule on Mount Athos that, I don't think it still applies, but they used to have a rule saying that if a person wants to become a monk on Mount Athos, you can't come until you have a beard. So or maybe it wasn't that, but maybe it was something also of just how the younger a person is, the more immature they're going to be, and the less likely they will be able to be following a sort of a healthy sort of monastic discipline. And I saw that very clearly when I was at St. Anthony's, because there's once there was a whole family that wanted to become monks and nuns. So that there was the mother and the wife, husband and the wife, and then they had three children, and their ages were, they had two boys, age 14 and 11, and a daughter, age 8. And they all wanted to become monks and nuns, including the 8-year-old. And so what ended up happening is the mother and the 8-year-old daughter went to a women's monastery, and then the father with his two boys, 14 and 11, ended up going to the men's monastery, where they were actually ended up going to St. Anthony's. And this was way back in the beginning. It was like, I think it was 1995 or 96. Anyway, and so I was the one appointed to be the teacher for these two kids. They were 14 and 11-year-olds, because they still had to do school, but we didn't want to send them to public school, so we just homeschooled them at the monastery. And I was the teacher, and that was a total disaster. I mean, I could tell you. I mean, I really feel for all parents who have to raise teenage kids. I mean, yeah, I don't know how they do it, but anyway, I saw that, trying to keep discipline and keep them, I mean, it's hard enough to just keep them disciplined, let alone keep them on a spiritual path and praying and being obedient and, trying to live monastically. That just like, anyway, so that was, yeah. So I think, and that probably goes along with number 6 on page 171. It says, a man who stays with a youth comes to grief if he be not strong. If he be strong, he does not come to grief. However, he does not progress. And so I think, I'm guessing what he's talking about, like, in this cryptic sort of saying, is that it can be such a strain for a monk to try to deal with an immature young kid, that it'll just keep them from being able to pray and be at peace and everything. And yeah, so I can sympathize with that. It was, yeah.
So did they end up becoming?
No, they didn't. Oh, hello, Olivia. Hello. Yeah. Oh, no problem. Yeah. So what ended up happening was that the mother, after about maybe 5 or 6 months, started missing her two boys so much that she just couldn't bear it. And so she said, no, we got to leave the monastery. We got to reunite our family. Yeah. So, and maybe it was for the best, because the kids really weren't mature. They weren't really ready for that. I remember the young one, the 11-year-old, he would get so upset with me that when I was trying to be strict with him, he'd say, "You hate my guts." And I said, "I love your guts." And then he laughed at that. And then it was sort of like our little phrase. He'd come with me and say, "Hey, Papa, I love your guts." So they're really cute. But yeah, they really weren't ready for a monastery life.
Wait, how old were the children?
Oh, so they were 14 and 11. They were novices at the monastery. Yeah. Yeah, they was too young. Yeah.
It was because they wanted to.
Yeah, no, they wanted, the whole family became monks, and well, they're not novices, they became novices, but then they didn't last. So yeah. Okay, so let's see, going on to page 172, co-priest number 3. And this is where there's a story of how the whole skit, all the monks got together because they were going to have a discussion, who is this Melchizedek person in Daniel chapter 8. And in the Old Testament, this Melchizedek figure, he's sort of a very mysterious person, because he sort of just comes out of nowhere, and then he offers bread and wine, which are really weird sacrifices for the Old Testament. And then he even blesses Abraham, which is like, well, wait, who is this guy blessing Abraham? I mean, because, as they say, the lesser is blessed by the greater. So if he's blessing Abraham, who, so people were thinking, maybe this is like another son of God, or maybe it's God himself, or, you know, so there's this discussion of who is this Melchizedek person. And then, but then when they invited Caprice, he would say for this discussion, this theological discussion, he struck his mouth or his face 3 times, saying, "Ah, woe to you, Caprice, for you have been leaving aside the things of God commanded you to do." In other words, living the commandments. And now you are inquiring into what he does not require of you. And so, in other words, getting involved in all this abstract theological, hypothetical discussion. And so when the other monks saw him do this, they're like, "Oh yeah, well, maybe he's right. Yeah, we better not just sit around talking about these abstract things. We better just actually pray and live our life, you know." And so it's just, I mean, of course, I mean, it's not bad to talk about these theoretical kind of things and have these discussions, because many times, you know, these theoretical things can be very inspiring and helpful in our life. I mean, like even like what we're doing now. I mean, these kind of discussions, they can shed some light onto whatever struggles we're having. But the point is well taken, that, you know, if we get too theoretical and too you know, up in the clouds, in a sense, you know, we can forget about living the spiritual. And I would say that that's actually a very common temptation, especially now, and now that they have all kinds of online forums where they discuss orthodox matters, because people can get so involved in these online discussions and arguments, or criticizing this priest or that bishop or that patriarch, and then they're spending like hours on this and almost no time at all on their own prayer and you know, living life. So yeah, so this is pertinent even to us today, I would say. Yeah. Okay, so moving on to Cyrus on page 172. It's a little bit it's a little bit unclear exactly what he's saying, but I think what he's saying is if you do not have logismi, if you do not have thoughts, you have the act. This means that he who does not battle sin in his mind nor contradict it physically indulges in it. So what he's saying is that there's two kind of people. There's people who, when a carnal thought, a temptation comes to them, they'll resist it and fight against it. And then there are kind of people who just give into it. And so the people who just give into it, they don't have any warfare. They're not struggling. There's no turmoil, because they're just giving right into the temptation. So that of course, that kind of peace, that kind of absence of turmoil is a very bad state to be in, because you're not fighting against the temptation. You're just giving into sin. So he's saying that we do need to have a battle. It's a good sign if there's a battle going on. And then also the last saying, he says, "Have no fear." So then the elder asked the brother, "You are not in the habit of talking with a woman?" And the brother said, "No. Old and young images are my thoughts. It is memories that trouble me, and statues of women." In other words, these are things he's seen in the past. And so the elder said to him, "Have no fear of the dead, but flee from the living and persevere more in prayer." So he's saying, okay, so it's fine. Okay, I mean, it's unavoidable to have memories that could be tempting, but as long as you're not increasing your temptation by being with women, well, then you're fine. And of course, this is spoken to a monk who's out in the middle of the desert of Egypt, where a woman wouldn't be anyway. So that's why it's applicable to him, whereas most people wouldn't be in a place where they would be able to not be able to interact with the other gender. So okay, so now on page 173, Lucius, and now here's a story about monks called Ephetes, and now what these are Messalians, is what the technical name is for another name for these Ephetes. And the reason they're called Ephetes, which is from the Greek word ephe, prayer, is because it was a heresy. It was a heretical group of people who believed that it's only prayer that's going to save our souls, and it's not the sacraments. You know, it doesn't matter if you receive communion. It doesn't really matter if you're baptized. It really matters if you're praying all the time. And so these heretics, these Messalians, they even neglected worldly affairs and just physical things that were in terms of doing work in order so that they would be able to pray constantly. And so these people were condemned as heretics by the church. So anyway, that's the setting of who these Epithetas, these Messalians are. So these monks once visited Abba Lucius, and he said, "What do you guys do for your handiwork to support yourselves?" And then they said, "Oh, we don't do any handiwork because we pray without ceasing. We're more spiritual than you." But then he takes them down a peg. He said, "Well, wait, don't you eat?" He said, "Well, yeah, we eat." And then he says, "Well, who prays for you when you're eating?" And they said, "Oh, I don't know." And they say, "Well, don't you sleep?" They said, "Yeah, well, we sleep." Then who's praying for you when you're sleeping? And like, "Oh, well, I guess nobody." And then he says to them, "Well, this is how I do things. I work, and then with the what I gain out of my works, these baskets I weave, or whatever, I give them as alms, either the money or the baskets themselves. No, it looks like the money itself. And then the people who accept my money will be praying for me, and that way they'll be praying for me even when I'm asleep." So it's sort of a kind of a cute way of thinking that he's praying without ceasing. But yeah, it emphasizes again the value of work. But it's also interesting to see that how they associate giving alms with receiving prayers. And in fact, there's even a story, and maybe it's coming up later in this book, of there was a monk in the desert and then some person came from the city and wanted to give him some money as a donation, and the monk said, no, I can't take your money. I got way too much. I'm so busy praying for myself, I can't pray for you also. so they did have this very, of course, there's a time in the world where people had a great deal of philotimo, a great deal of inner nobility, in the sense that they wouldn't just take something for free. They would, if they were given some donation, they would feel indebted to the person, and the way they would often, especially monks, would repay that debt that they felt was by praying for them. And so, yeah, so it is a very beautiful way, and this, of course, we can also implement in our own lives too. If someone does give us something, whether it might not necessarily be money, but if they do a favor for us or whatever, they sacrifice and spend some time for us, whatever, we can, I realize that, hey, wait, I'm indebted to this person. I owe him something. At least let me pray for him. So, yeah. Okay, so moving on to page 174, there's now Abba Lot, and this, of course, is different from the Lot of the Old Testament. There's New Testament times. And there's an incident when it turns out that they let someone live in the same area where they were. They let some other monks live there, but then after they settled down and lived there, they found out that these monks are actually not Orthodox; they're heretics. And so then they came to Abba Lot asking him, "What are we going to do about these heretics living here? Because if we have these heretics living here, people are going to think we're heretics also." And specifically, it was these monks were quoting Origen. And now the thing about Origen, it's a very interesting person. He was born in the end of the 2nd century, so he was one of the very early fathers of the church, and he was someone who was absolutely brilliant, and he had so many wise insights about the scriptures, and he even made comparison of existing manuscripts of the Bible, and he was like considered one of the first biblical scholars to say, okay, well, what was the original Bible like? And and he had and many of the church fathers relied on his insights and developed them and ran with it. But then the only problem is that Origen also had some ideas, ideas about theology that actually were heresies. So in particular, the three primary heresies he was preaching was, one was this thing called the apokatastasis, and this means, this is a Greek word that means restoration. And so this means that he had the belief that because God is love, after the second coming, God's love will be so powerful that it'll save everybody. It'll save even the demons. Everyone will go to paradise, and we'll live happily ever after. And so, but the problem with this idea that there's this apokatastasis, that there's the restoration, that everyone's going to be saved eternally, it pretty much goes directly against what Christ said about, that there is hell, that there's eternal fire prepared for the demons. And so yeah, so that's a real problem so that's one of his heresies. Another one of his heresies is that that souls are something that pre-existed. In other words, our soul didn't get created the moment we were conceived, but it actually already existed somewhere, and then God pulled it out of the freezer and stuck it in our body, and then so this is also condemned as a heresy. And then the third heresy had is that God the Father is somehow greater than the other two persons of the Holy Trinity. That the LRC's God the Father is greater than Jesus Christ, God the Son, and also greater than God the Holy Spirit. So there's also condemned. So these are the three primary heresies of Origen. And so because of that, the Fifth Ecumenical Council actually condemned him as a heretic. But it's interesting, though, that even though he was condemned as a heretic, the Holy Fathers, they didn't have this black and white approach towards him, or just in general towards any heretic. They're able to see that, okay, yes, Origen had all these crazy heretical ideas, these theological things that are obviously wrong, but he had a lot of ideas that were really brilliant and very useful. And so let's actually develop these and focus on these and use them. So yeah, and so that really is also a good example for us too, to not see things in terms of black and white, to acknowledge that even if someone's a heretic, that doesn't mean that they don't have good in them, and they can have something even worth emulating, and something that we can benefit from seeing how they live their life, or even some ideas they have. Of course, this kind of thing takes real caution too, because you can get in trouble by accepting too much from someone who's obviously a heretic. Yeah, anyway, so then getting back to the story, he says, okay, what are we going to do with these heretics that are living with us? And he says, and so Abba Arsenius said to him, well, don't chase him away, but say to him, here, eat the gifts of God and drink what you like. Only do not say that thing anymore. In other words, don't stop talking about these things, with these heretical teachings you have, but you're welcome to stay here as much as you like. And then if he's willing, he will reform. In other words, if he sees that we're actually good people here, we Orthodox people are good, he can actually be touched by our goodness, our warmth, and convert from his heretical group to us. Or if he doesn't reform, if he is unwilling to reform, Abba Arsenius said, he of his own free will be going to ask to leave this place. And so that's exactly what ended up happening. These heretics saw that, we don't like being constricted in our ability to talk freely about what we believe is right about this wonderful teacher Origen, and so we're getting out of here. And so that was a very peaceful way of resolving the conflict. Yeah, and this does actually remind me of how also Yaron Dafem, my elder, would deal with some people at St. Anthony's Monastery, because there's just very many people coming there, not only as visitors, but also many people would come there to become novices, and many of the novices end up becoming monks as well, but not all of them. Maybe I don't know, half of them, or maybe a little more than half. But there I remember more than the more well anyway, one particular novice was there who he really wasn't living monastically, and it was clear that he's not cut out to be a monk, and but he's not really causing any real problems for the brotherhood. I mean, it just that he was just obviously not cut out for it. So I asked him, should we tell him to leave since he's not really living the monastic way? And Yair Ephraim said, well, no, let's not kick him out of the monastery, because if we kick him out, then he'll have hard feelings, and who knows, he might even slander us, or who knows what. We'll just be patient with him as long as he's not causing problems for the monastery. And on his own, he'll see that this is the way of the monastery is going this way, and he's going this way. And so it's just a matter of time before he realizes, hey, this is not my place. And so that's what ended up happening. So after a little while, a couple more months, this novice saw that, yeah, this isn't in line with what I want in life, and so he just peacefully left, and so that was fine. Yeah. So all right. So and then lot number 2 on page 174 or 175, it's a story about a monk who had fallen into sin, and he was too embarrassed to confess it to the priest. But then Abba Lot said, okay, well, confess it to me, and I will bear it, he said. And so he explained that he fell into fornication and sacrificed to idols. And then so even though these are very serious sins, obviously, the elder said to him, be of good cheer. There is repentance. Go stay in the cave and fast every other day, and together with you, I will bear half the sin. And so what he means by bearing half the sin, it's not clear. That there are two things it could mean. One thing it could mean is that he's saying, okay, when it's time for judgment, and God's going to judge you, I'll bear half the burden of this, and I'll bear this. I'll pay for it also when I'm judged. The other thing it could have meant, I think it means the second meaning is that there's probably a particular penance involved. Because whenever we commit a serious sin, the priest almost always will give a penance according to what the sin was. In fact, there's one of the things that the ecumenical councils declared. They made a whole long list of all the sins and what penance would be appropriate for that. And so, for example, they say if you did an abortion, you'll have. I think that what they say is you can't receive until the end of your life when you're on your deathbed. Which is, of course, it's really harsh. I mean, and other things like this that are, and in fact, things are so harsh. And this, by the way, in these canons, they're called these rules of the ecumenical synods. They are collected in around the year 1800 by Saint Nicodemus, and they're all put together in one book, and he called it the Pidalion, the rudder. Because he saw that all these decisions of the ecumenical councils, they're what steer the ship of the church and keep it on track. So he called it the rudder. Because these canons of the church don't talk only about penances for sins, but all other kinds of things of behavior, like, for example, that you shouldn't pray with heretics or all these other things. But the only problem with this Pidalion, this rudder, is that these canons were written 1,000 years ago in a very different society, and in a time when people also their ability to be patient was very different. And there's one, and perhaps you've heard this story about Saint Porphyrios, who he passed away about 35 years ago, and when he was a young higher monk in his 20s, and he started giving penances, people started coming for confession, and they would say, for example, okay, I did an abortion. And so we'd look up in the Pidal, in the rules and the canons, and see that the Holy Father say, okay, this person can't receive until they're on the deathbed. And so he'd tell this person, this poor woman, okay, well, yes, I can read you the prayer of absolution, but you can't receive communion again until you're on your deathbed. And so, and this kind of thing. And so, which are extremely harsh. And most people, I mean, in the old days, people could bear that kind of penance, and they would be patient, and they wouldn't give up on their spiritual struggle. They would actually be something that helped them repent even more deeply and fight the good fight. But nowadays people really are weaker. And so he gave, there's this one particular guy, he gave a penance of I don't know how many years of not receiving communion. And then later, a few months later, he happened to see this man again, just like in a store or somewhere. And St. Porphyrius said to him, "Hey, where you been? I haven't seen you in church for a while." And the guy said to him, "Yeah, well, I figure if I'm not going to be able to receive communion for so many years, no point in going to church. I'll just come back when the time is up." And then St. Porphyrius said, "Wait a second, something's not right here. If my purpose, if the purpose in giving a penance to someone, epithemion, is to help them repent and help them be closer to God and be more, then I'm giving them way too harsh a medicine. I'm actually giving something that's harming this person." So he realized he has to tone things down a lot. And so that's what pretty much all spiritual fathers will do nowadays, that they won't follow literally what the canons say in terms of what the penance should be in terms of abstaining for communion for years and years, but they'll find some much more lenient thing, something that will actually help the person repent. In fact, there's one very interesting story that I was told by the abbot in our Greek monastery in Texas, Father Dositheos. He was telling me how one woman came to him once for confession, and based on her confession, he said, "Well, you know what you've done, it's a pretty serious sin, and you need to, you really, what my elder would say is that you really shouldn't receive communion for a whole year." And she said, "Oh, a whole year? Oh, but I need communion. I can't go that long without communion. Please don't give me that." He said, "Well, okay, I'm not going to force it on you, but it really is to your benefit to have this kind of penance of time away from communion." And she just was just not hearing it. She just was saying, "Oh no, I just can't do this." And so he said, "Okay, fine. Well, if I can't, I'm not going to force it on you, but I'm just warning you, this is actually really something you're missing out on, actually a greater benefit by not receiving communion for a time." And she said, "Oh no, okay, well fine. I'm not gonna have this communion. I can't do a whole year without communion." So he said, "Okay, fine." So he let her, but let her have the forgiveness without the penance. But then what ended up happening was, in her house, right after this, she would start seeing demons in her house, and they would appear as little like dwarf things, and they'd be running around and causing havoc. And so she went back to him and said, "Yarda, what's going on?" The father goes, "What's going on? I got all these demons in my house." And he said, "Well, I mean that's it's because of what's going on. I mean, you need a penance. You need to be you need to deepen your repentance, and you're not really ready to receive communion now, because it does say very clearly in the New Testament that receiving communion when you're not ready for it can actually harm you." And so this woman was finally convinced to receive the penance, and this freed her from having the demons in her house. And so, yeah, so it is a big deal to have, it is to our benefit, even though it seems like it's a tough thing to be without communion, if that's what the penance is. Okay, so moving on to page, okay,
Christos Honesty, can I ask a question if it's possible?
Yes.
I was just sort of like on the same line that you were talking about with the story about Yarunda. How can we try to be more ipakoi, more obedient to our spiritual fathers, even though we know that they have our best interests at heart, but we're very stubborn. And sometimes we don't want to listen because we want to have our own self-will. And we know that what they're saying comes from agape, but how do we kind of just go
Yeah.
with the flow, like go with their own with what they want for us?
Yeah, so I mean that is the hardest thing. I mean, obedience really is the most challenging of all virtues because it does require us to cut off our own will and sacrifice, and to submit ourselves. And our pride doesn't want that, and our pride really is a very difficult thing to overcome. So, I mean, one thing that can be helpful is if we can remind ourselves that that it's through obedience that we're going to be getting grace, and that if we cut off our will, especially to a spiritual, oh, you gotta go, yeah, okay, that's right to see you, God bless you. If we can cut off our will, this is going to give us a lot of grace and a lot of humility. And this is something that hopefully by educating ourselves by being familiar with what obedience does, how powerful it is, then we can be more eager to do it. And what I mean by educating ourselves is by reading the lives of the saints and seeing examples, or reading like these kinds of books, like Lives of the Desert Fathers, or all these things. They really highlight how helpful it is to be obedient. So this can be one way that can make us more eager. Another thing is also just to remember that the whole point of confession, it's sort of like going to the doctor of the soul. Just like you go to a physical doctor when you know you're not feeling well, you need help physiological with your physical body, and you generally trust the doctor. I mean, the doctor might not be infallible, but generally the doctor knows more than you do. And so following the doctor's advice 9 times out of 10 is going to be the best thing to do. And so the same thing with a spiritual doctor, our confessor, almost all the time the things he's going to tell us really are to our benefit, even if we might not like it. So, yeah. Okay, moving on to Longinos on 175. Oh, I'll just say this one last thing. Anyways, we're running out of time, so I'll just say this. So number 1 on Longinos, and it's kind of even more amusing if you really look at it. So Abba Longinos went to another desert father and with 3 thoughts of his. He says, I want to live in exile, just out in the desert, far away from everybody, or actually rather in a foreign land. And the elder shoots him down and says, well, if you can't master your tongue, you're not in exile wherever you go. So master your tongue here and you're in exile. And so then he says, yeah, I want to fast. Yeah. And the elder shoots him down again and says, the prophet Isaiah said, if you bend your neck like a collar in a ring, not even so will he call it an acceptable fast. Rather, master the evil logismi. In other words, fight your thoughts. Don't worry about trying to be a super faster or something. And then this monk says the 3rd time, I want to avoid people. And then he shoots him down again. He says, unless you first live a good life with people, you will not be able to live a good life alone either. So I mean, I could just see the guy, the poor monk. He has all this zeal, and then he gets just crushed by this guy. So, yeah, but it does emphasize, that it really is the inner struggle that matters. And as they say in Greek, then sozio topos allotropos. They say it's not the place that saves, but it's the way you live in that place. And because it's nice that tropos and topos, right, way and place sound the same in Greek. But yeah, so that's also very encouraging for us too, to know that, because most of us really can't change our place where we are. We can't change who the members of our family are. We can't change, and so yeah, what really matters is how we deal with them, and then that's going to save us or not.
So how harmful is it to move around
from
city to city?
Yeah. So the saints of the church have said that they say, and this is regarding monks, they would say, just as a tree that's constantly transplanted from place to place will not grow roots and not flourish and bear fruit, The same thing with a monk who's constantly going from place to place will not bear fruit and flourish. And the reason for this primarily because the reason why people change from place to place is because they've become impatient with whatever difficulty they have. And instead of being patient and facing the challenges, they just say, "Oh, I'm going to run away. I'm going to run away and run away." And but they can't run away from your own passions. In fact, there's a very cute story from the Desert Fathers where a monk loses patience and he says, "That's it. I'm out of here. I can't stand living in this cell in the desert anymore." So he gets his stuff. He starts packing up his bag to go. But then as he's packing up his bags, he sees a demon right next to him packing up its bag. And he says, "Hey, who are you?" And the demon says, "Oh, I'm the one who gave you the thought to leave this place. Since you're leaving, I'm coming with you." And then the monk realizes, he says, "Wait a second. If this demon that's giving me impatience is going to follow me wherever I go, what's the point in going somewhere else? I might as well just find him right here where I am." And so then he decides not to pack the bags and go. All right, so I better stop there. It's time now. All right, well, thank you for joining. And and this following Saturday, we'll have book club, but it'll be a half hour later. So instead of 10:30 Chicago time, it'll be 11 o'clock Chicago time. So I hope that doesn't throw anybody off. I'll also mention this in the announcement coming up. I have to mention, so we'll get another 10 pages. So I guess we'll get up to page, let's see, where can we, so page 185, yeah, we'll go up to page 185, we're on 175.